Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Jose, for inviting me here today. Yeah, so I think Jay did a really good introduction at explaining who I am. So yeah, I'm a PhD candidate here at McMaster in chemical and bioengineering. I'm actually co-supervised also in the Department of Medicine. So I work with inflammatory bowel disease patients, design animal models, and now I'm trying to figure out how you can use viruses to treat those types of bacterial-driven inflammation. But you're not here to listen to my PhD research. Hopefully, in a year's time, you could come to my defense. That's hopefully when I will be defended. But like Jay said, I've been working in, broadly speaking, healthcare entrepreneurship for the past 6 years or so, even through my undergrad. So I founded three biotech companies in my past. All of them have failed successfully, and that's just the way that startup works. But I learned a lot from those companies, and quite frankly, you oftentimes learn more when you start a company versus when you're actually in school learning about how to build a company. You learn a lot more from those operator experiences. And then about 3 years ago or so, I kind of pivoted more towards what's called buy side, so kind of the finance industry as it relates to healthcare and life science innovation. So I've worked as a consultant at Bloom Burton, which is an investment bank based out of Toronto that exclusively focuses in healthcare. I'm currently an analyst at Hale Health, which is Canada's largest angel investment network for physician MDs, as well as dentists. And then I'm also the investment director at Front Row Ventures, as Jay said, which is kind of the predominant capacity I'm in here for today, which is a student-focused VC fund, which is the kind of the main topic of today's conversation, where I'm going to hopefully talk to you about the opportunities U.S. students and also the faculty here for healthcare entrepreneurship and just entrepreneurship in general from academia. So when I asked Jay and Jose what I should present on today, they kind of said, well, first of all, how many people in here know what venture capital is? Raise your hand. Okay, so maybe a third of you. Most times when you think about venture capital, you probably think of like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank on TV. That's a nice introduction to what it actually is, but that's also very far from what it is in reality. So I think the first part of this seminar talk, I'm going to try to reserve a lot of time at the end for Q&A because I think that's where the most value is here. So I'm going to give you a crash course on venture capital and how it works and particularly how funds operate and what they look for in investments. And then I'll spend a bit of time towards the end towards more so academic innovation, how you can potentially support translating your research into real world startups, and what are some resources available for you, particularly within biomaterials and regenerative medicine. So I've tried to mingle that in as well. So venture capital. And please feel free to interrupt during the talk. I'm happy to take questions during the time as well. So venture capital is a form of private equity. And when you think about finance as an industry, you often think about hedge funds or publicly traded markets and all these banks. So they're oftentimes investing in publicly traded companies such as Apple or Microsoft or Google. Private equity is the flip side. You are investing into companies that are private. They are not listed on a publicly exchanged company. And private equity in its own right is also a subsector of this industry. They hold millions and millions of dollars and they buy what are known as later stage companies. Venture capital is more of the earlier stage. So they invest in essentially high risk startups that are potential to grow exponentially over time. So they invest in companies and they make money by owning equity in that company. So they'll pay out $100,000, get 10% of that company. Now they become part of that company and want to help it grow because then their investment into that company, the value of that investment will grow as they, as investors, support that company. So VCs in general, they tend to differ by a variety of factors. So the stage of a company, it could be really early ideation, which we'll get to in a second, or it could be more late stage where in the context of biomaterials or regenerative medicine, a clinical stage company. So phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. Different types of venture capital firms will invest at different types of stages. And we'll get into that a little bit. They can also differ in terms of geography. So Canada versus the States versus Europe. That is the essential core to the thesis. And it's very much a people-centered kind of industry, if you like talking to people and if you like meeting new people and learning about cool technology, VC is a career path I would recommend you look into. In contrast to more late stage kind of investment companies, when you think of like hedge funds, for example, or banks, there's not a lot of tangible metrics that you can base these decisions off of. It's a lot more of intangible. And this is really important in the context of academia because you're not going to, for example, have revenue for most of the things that you are developing. A lot of the core value in your early stage company is going to derive from your intellectual property, what your co-development deals are with strategic partners, what your partnership is with hospitals, for example. Those are all factors that are going to contribute to what makes a determination on whether or not a venture capital is going to invest in your company or not. So plugging away, because I know we started late, so I want to make sure that we can talk about stuff. So where what are the needs and goals of a venture capital firm, and where do they get their money from? Well, they really get it from friends and family. They get it from, sorry, I'm again, I'm unfortunately a little bit flustered because of the late start, but in terms of funding, venture capital is not the only type of funding you can get. There are different types of early stage funding that you can get. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on here because I don't think it's really where it's important, but you can get it from angel investors. So these are high net worth individuals. Think of like the Bill Gates of the world. They invest in early stage companies. You can ask your friends and family. So your brother, for example, who thinks you have a great idea and they want to help support that. Family offices. So these are investment firms that manage the assets of a high net worth family. So think about the Zuckerbergs, for example, or the Gates family. And then there's also accelerators, and we'll get to that way later on. But in a nutshell, when you think about a venture capital firm, this is your typical structure. And I know this figure is really small, but I think it's important for you to understand where the money is actually coming from. So the venture capital firm that most people think about is this guy right here. It's going to be a partnership agreement between various people, and that pool of money is going to be invested into company one, company two, company three, all across that portfolio. And so this is essentially a holding company. That's where the money is. But who manages that money and where does that money come from? Well, in terms of the management, so this is a fund. The management comes from the actual firm itself. So if you think about a well-known firm in Toronto called Lemire Ventures, they're a very common firm. They have multiple funds. So this guy, this firm manages the actual money. And that firm is comprised of general partners as well as the analysts and associates. They help with the operations side. Okay, they help determine what money from this fund should go into what companies. Okay, so that's kind of the operations side of VC structure. The money comes from over here. Okay, limited partners, LPs. So these are larger investment funds. Think about banks. They are brokers. They are hedge funds. They are companies in their own right. So Johnson & Johnson, for example, a well-known pharmaceutical company, they invest in venture capital funds. They could be endowments. So McMaster University, for example, they invest into venture capital funds as well. And there's a whole bunch of other examples, but that's really where the money comes from. And if you've ever taken a entrepreneurship course, oh yeah, please. Yep.
The equity that is bought with that venture capital, is it for Johnson & Johnson or is it for the venture capital?
No, so it's the money that you get from these limited partners, it goes into essentially a centralized pot of money. And this fund itself, so it could be, let's say, a $10 million fund, at the end of its life cycle, which we'll talk about in a few slides, you'll liquidate your position in all of the companies that you have invested in. And the cash that you get from that liquidation event then goes back to the fund. And then that fund is then sent back to the actual investors as well as to the management. And that's how you get a return. So the equity does not directly go to Johnson & Johnson in your example. Johnson & Johnson is investing in this fund with the notion that it's going to be investing in asset classes, companies that it is aligned with, and they're going to make money from that. But a person like Johnson & Johnson, for example, will also do that from a strategic standpoint to get early access to companies that they might not have radar on. They might not know that they exist. And so if they hear that venture capital firm XYZ invests in the next coolest regenerative medicine company, then hey, that might be an introduction between that company and the Johnson & Johnson LP, and that could be an acquisition opportunity in 10 years' time. So large companies such as Johnson & Johnson, other biotech and pharmaceutical companies oftentimes do this to promote their skeleton opportunities for acquisition targets in the future. So again, yeah, if you've ever taken an entrepreneurship course or innovation course, you've probably seen this graph. It's kind of the business life cycle. It's also synonymous with the financing life cycle. So we're not even going to focus on all of this because that could take an hour-long lecture. We're going to focus on here, the valley of death, okay? Because that's really where a lot of academic innovation is, well, killed when it comes to kind of translating it into the market. The valley of death is where you are beholden to non-dilutive funding sources from like CIHR, for example, NSERC, foundations, and you might get some pre-seed, seed stage investment. I know those are terms you probably don't know about, but essentially that means early investment from a venture capital firm or from an angel investor. And this is just money to kind of help you survive this valley of death. And this is where in academia, for example, I'm sure as we're all graduate students in the room can share, experiments fail. That's life. Same thing at these startup companies. The money is there to support them to get out of this valley of death, and oftentimes they don't. And that's just a reality of investments as well. A lot of the time, your investment as a venture capitalist is going to go nowhere. So one thing to kind of keep in mind, and this is really important as academics as well when you're trying to think about building a company, is are you actually venture backable? Okay, this is a topic that most people don't really want to have, a conversation that people just don't really want to have. It's really awesome to say to yourself, hey, I was able to raise $2 million. But do you actually want to raise that $2 million? Okay. One of the very first questions that you should ask yourself is, can you achieve your milestones? For example, let's say you're doing a mouse study, okay? Can you achieve that mouse study with the resources you have right now, or do you need to delay that mouse study in order to actually get additional funding, okay? It's a conversation you have yourself. In the world of finance and venture capital, when you take on venture money, you're diluting your position within the company. Okay, so you're making your position inevitably weaker, okay, especially when there's a potential buyout in the future. And so if you are able to achieve your milestones right now and within the next 6 to 8 months, for example, without taking on additional dilutive investment from an investor, then it's a conversation you should have with you and your co-founder. Say, hey, like maybe we don't actually need to take on this investor. How much value are they going to provide to us as a company? Because yes, investors give you money, but they also provide you with strategic advice, network opportunities, et cetera. But if those do not outweigh the con of now you owning less of your company, it's something you should have a frank conversation about. And this really gets into point 2, are you willing to trade ownership? At the end of the day, as I say, you're bringing on an investor, and that's going to be a partner now in your company as you grow. And that means that you are beholden to someone else in your company. Yes, you're getting additional cash. Yes, you're getting additional access to the ecosystem. But does all of that outweigh your relinquishing of actually ownership in the company? Are you personally ambitious? There's an unfortunate kind of misconception with venture capital where you get money and then you kind of slow roll it. In academia, we know we can take our time to kind of think of a problem. When you take on venture money from an investor, there's an expectation that you are going to scale very quickly. And if you do not do that, you as a founder could be removed from the company. Okay, because now you're taking on additional shareholders in the company and they have the legal right now to push you aside if you are not scaling the company in alignment with their vision and with the vision of the whole company. So you need to be aware that if you're going to found a company based on academic research, for example, if you are a professor, how are you going to balance your time as a professor versus being a startup founder, a CEO, for example? Do you have that bandwidth, that time to dedicate to building a company? And are you focused on getting big fast? Again, very similar to point three. At the end of the day, finance and investing in early stage companies is all about making a return on your investment. Okay, you want to get as big as possible. You don't want to kind of say, hey, let's see what happens if we do this experiment. No, you want to have a direct focus and go for that. So venture capital, knowing if you're a venture backable, really important conversation to have. What do VCs look for? We're going to just focus on this section. We'll skip the rest because this is really where it's pertinent to you. At the pre-seed stage, so very early, so ideation, so when you're trying to spin out academic research from your lab, there are 5 kind of key points that most venture capital firms look for. They look for the founding team. Do you have the right technical expertise? And do you also have the right business expertise to complement that? Do you have a vision? Do you have a disruptive idea? Will your idea completely revolutionize an industry, or is it going to be a marginal improvement? What's your IP look like? This is really important when it comes to academia. And again, we could probably have a conversation on this for an entire seminar if we wanted to. Universities in general don't like to what's called assign their IP away, because as a university, as academics here, we don't actually own our IP. Okay, we are using the resources of McMaster University to push our research forward. Because we're using their resources and their money and their time, they actually own the IP. When you file a disclosure to Milo, McMaster Industry Liaison Office, they are taking on the risk by filing that patent and all the costs and risk associated with that. And then you're going to license that back to you for your operations. Okay. That's a very, very quick overview of that, but it's something to kind of keep in mind. We could go into a lot of detail on that in the Q&A if you have questions about licensing agreements from a university, but it's a really important factor with respect to startup development through academia. Non-dilutive funding, they want to see if you've been able to achieve milestones through grants. So academia is fantastic for this because professors spend hours and hours and hours writing grants for their students and for their research. So having a strong track record of winning grants is a good sign. And then they also want to look at big market. Okay, like, is this a large enough market to actually disrupt? I was talking to Jay and to Jose earlier about market sizing for general biomaterials and regenerative medicine. Right now, it might be small, but it's projected to be quite large. And the introduction of disruptive technology will just really exacerbate that, accelerate that market size. And so being able to highlight what the opportunity looks like for investors in the next 5-10 years is something that we often look at that early stage for a cycle. What does it look like in the next few years? And as you go later within the business life cycle, again, very quickly going over this, we want to see like expert advisors. We want to see whether or not you're being able to gain customer traction. We want to see if there's actually product market fit. And then really further down, unit economics, revenue, and then is there an acquisition opportunity? Is there an exit that we can do? But again, that's not extremely relevant for the conversation we're having today, but happy to go into it at a later point. So I spoke on this very briefly before, talking about the life cycle of venture capital fund, sorry. Typically speaking, a fund lasts for 10 years, okay? So in year 1, this is kind of like formation. This is where the general partner of the firm will be like, hey, I like this thesis. I like to invest in regenerative medicine. I'm going to go form a fund with a thesis of investing in novel regenerative medicine companies. So I'm going to go to my contacts at RBC. I'm going to go to my contacts at the TSB endowment fund. I'm going to go McMaster University to their endowment fund. I'm going to try to build a fund that is $40 million. I'm going to get their money to do that. That's kind of what year 1 looks like. Year 2 to 5 is all about investing, going out, deal sourcing, and making first investments into innovative companies. After that, I've kind of bucket this into one term, harvesting. So this is where you're going to start reaping the rewards of your early investments, as well as doubling down on early investments. So in year 2 and 3, you might have made 2 investments into an early stage company. And by the time you get to year 6 of your fund, it might be an opportunity for you to actually liquidate your position because an acquisition has taken place or a later stage investor has come in and bought you out from that company. And then typically speaking, by year 10, because that is the typical legal life cycle of a fund, you need to actually give the money back to your original investors. That's when you will liquidate your position entirely. So you'll go explore secondary exits, which is a fancy way of saying you're going to sell your position in the company to another investor on the secondary market. Those are kind of backdoor deals, fun topic to discuss. And then, as I said, within this entire period, it's often typical for venture funds to double down the original investment. So if a company is raising another round, for example, they'll invest into that subsequent round to extend their position and gain more equity in that company because they believe it will be a $1 billion or $2 billion company. And then there's often times where you can actually extend. So if the limited partners, so the investors in the fund, believe that they are trusting of the actual venture capital firm for managing this money, they'll extend it to reap further rewards of this thesis. Okay, so but typically that doesn't go more than 2 years. So how many investments do you make? Well, that depends on a lot of factors, and these 6 are the biggest ones. So how large is the fund? A $10 million fund can have equivalent deployments as a $100 million fund, but the check sizes might vary. What is your thesis? So are you agnostic? So do you invest across the entire tech ecosystem, or do you invest specifically in biomaterials for wound dressing? It can be that granular. What's the fund's history? So who's managing the fund? Who are your LPs? So if you have, for example, Johnson & Johnson, and then you also have Apple, those are 2 very different companies. They might have different expectations for what types of companies you want to invest in. Who are your general partners? So these are your partners within the actual firm that is managing their fund, and their expertise from a technical and academic standpoint really influences what types of companies are invested into that fund. And then also general market conditions. So last year, we saw a massive boom in artificial intelligence investment across the board, across every single industry. But now we're starting to see it really go down. I mean, it's used as a buzzword, but I'll be honest, do not use artificial intelligence as a buzzword in your pitch decks, in any decks. I do not like seeing it because most of the time, people don't know what that means. Like even the founders themselves, they don't know what that means. So don't use it unless you're actually using it. So there's a rule in VC called the power law. And that essentially says that 6% of your investments produce 60% of your returns. If you remember when I said the valley of death earlier, that's where a lot of money is just thrown away and they typically fail. And that's just the reality of venture capital. The vast majority of your investments are going to go nowhere. You're going to lose money. You're going to maybe make a one-to-one return. It's not going to do anything for the fund. But you're eventually going to get some of these home run deals that return to you 10x on your initial investment. So if you put in $10,000, you might get $100,000 from that. Those are the deals that you want to make, and those very rarely happen just from a probability standpoint. It's very similar to baseball, to be honest with you. Babe Ruth, probably the best hitter of all time. He only had a batting average of like what, 0.36? Not great, but when he hit it, he really hit it. That's the mentality that most VCs take. They know they're going to miss a lot of opportunities, but when they hit that ball, they want to make sure they hit it far. So what does this actually look like in practicality? So think of all of these dots as the portfolio, okay? So you have the investment down below, you have the return on investment below. So these red bars are, you can think of like a negative number, okay? So I, as a fund, have invested proportional to what the size of the bar is, okay? And so let's say in 10 years, when I want to liquidate my position, I get a return on all these investments, and that represents the net positive here, okay? So the green bars are positive. And if you look kind of in general across the board here, it looks pretty good. You have some really nice high bars, but when you take a more granular look at it, all of the black ones were kind of net zero. You didn't make anything, you didn't lose anything. But on these 2 investments, for example, you only put, let's say, 1 unit into the company, but you got maybe 10 times the return on that. And that return alone is going to compensate for all of these investments that didn't go anywhere. That's the reality of venture capital, and that's the mentality that all VCs take. And as founders and as early stage academics who are thinking about going into biotech and into venture capital in general and want to raise money, this is something that you should really be aware about of how these funds operate and what is the mentality that they are taking.
So it's an interesting point. I mean, I was aware of that.
Yeah.
And so you're on the buy side, you're in the room.
Yep.
And you're all looking around with your colleagues that are looking at the potential, deals to invest in.
Yep.
And you all know that 7 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 are going to fail. How do you keep the optimism as the investor? And how do you, because that's important, right?
Yeah.
If you don't believe in your investment, why are you making, I mean, you must believe in them all at the starting.
Yeah. So there are so many factors that we can de-risk at making those decisions. Ultimately, whenever you make an investment, you are always strongly convicted on that deal. Okay. You believe that they are the next big thing, but you also need to acknowledge that there's going to be no industry where that company is going to be the only market player. There's always going to be many factors. I mean, if you look at all the GLP-1 inhibitors, for example, that are in development or are already commercialized. So there's 3 major ones that all the big pharmas are using right now. But last time I checked, is about 12 right now, additional ones in various stages of clinical development. And so those are all going to be competing with each other. You as the investor just need to have conviction that, hey, like the mechanism that you are using for this new drug asset, that's going to be superior to everyone else. And there's going to be various other factors at play here that's going to allow that company to succeed over everyone else. It's honestly like investing, and this is not a sexy way to say it, but investing is not a science. It's really not. It's an art, and it's a lot of luck. I'll be honest with you. I mean, like you can do as much as you want in doing diligence and doing research on companies, but at the end of the day, luck's a lot of it. That it's a lot of luck, and honestly, there's kind of a thrill to that. I'll be honest with you. It's exciting to see when a company that you invest in succeeds quite well. So I've been with Frontrunner Ventures for a few years now, and we invested into an AI discovery company a few years back called Valence Discoveries. They were acquired by Recursion Pharmaceuticals. So we invested $25,000 into that company they were valued, I think, $3 million when we invested in them. They were acquired for $55 million by Recursion Pharmaceuticals. So it's those types of deals where, because like we worked hard on that company, and we really wanted to help them achieve what they wanted to do, because we firmly believed in their vision and what they wanted to build. And so you as an investor always do everything you can to support your portfolio companies. But there comes a point, to your question, there comes a point where you need to acknowledge, hey, I may have been wrong here. As a PI too, for the PIs in the room, you need to acknowledge that, hey, like this project might not be the best one to go down to. So it's better to cut our losses and focus on the ones that are actually succeeding. And that happens. Yeah.
I wonder what 25K would do for a company. I wouldn't really bother even going after 25K. If I'm starting a company, even I don't apply for a grant, that's really 25K. So why would they apply for such a low one? And why would you invest such a low one?
So this is a question that we get all the time. So we don't invest 25K anymore. We do 50K with a follow-on of $100,000. One of the things you always got to keep in mind, especially when you're in academia, is money is earmarked. Okay, like you can only use money for very specific functions. And if you get a CIHR grant, for example, or any sort of research grant, you need to use that money as it was written in that grant. You cannot deviate. There's some wiggle room, but for the most part, you cannot deviate that much. Business is very similar, okay? And there's not a lot of grant money, for example, out there that can be used for discretionary spending with respect to salaries, for example, intellectual property, overall business expenses, so operating expenses, like how to run a lab, for example, how to go to conferences, network, all of that. So when you talk about $25,000, $50,000, yes, on paper it might not seem like a lot, but again, at such an early stage company, there aren't going to be many investors that are going to be willing to invest $2 million into an ideation company and scale from that. Oftentimes, you are going to be looking at individual check sizes of $50,000 to as high as maybe $250,000. Okay, so when you're fundraising a startup, you're going to be going to a lot of different people, a lot of different firms, and 9 times out of 10, they'll just shut the door on you. And that's the reality of it. And so you really, if you can raise $50,000, you take it. You really do. I know it might not seem like a lot, but you're going to have more no's than yeses. So
And does that, if I can, I mean, recognizing a small amount, it might not go that far, but isn't that a little bit of a nod of approval?
it is.
If it satisfies
Yeah.
someone's thesis, then maybe someone else kind of says,
Yeah.
I should be looking at this deal.
That's psychological thing.
Yeah.
There is. You also need to remember that the cash itself is just one aspect of it. It's also the resources that that firm will provide to you. So Front Row Ventures, for example, we have an alumni network of about 250. Every single one of us works in either VC as a full-time career, they work in investment banking, they work in consultant, or have gone on to be major operators at startup companies, or have gone to major Fortune 500 companies. So you're not just getting the cash, you're also getting the access to that network, which is oftentimes more valuable.
That's what sharks say in the Shark Tank.
And it's true. That's the one thing about Shark Tank that I will agree with. The network and who your investors are is just as important, if not more, than the actual dollar amount. So speaking of investors, who are the big ones? So the biggest ones in Canada, as it pertains to life sciences, which includes biomaterials and regenerative medicine, Lumira, Amplitude. IGAN's more medical devices, but they do BIMRaterial work. Genesis Capital and 60 Degree Capital. There's a bunch of other ones that I didn't list there, but those are the ones that are the major players in Canada. And they all have very different theses, very different stages at which they invest at. Lumira, for example, they'll invest in a company when they're at phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials and trying to support you getting to real commercialization or acquisition. Again, more medical device, but they invest in companies at more seed to Series A. So think kind of like when you're trying to on the cusp of translating something from academia into a tangible market asset. Genesis Capital, very similar. Amplitude is probably the earliest one. So if you are thinking about spinning out your research into a company, Amplitude would be the one to talk to right away. So they have a subsidiary called Preamp. So it's their venture creation studio. They will invest anywhere from ideation stage. So if you have a grant that you want to submit it to Amplitude, for example. They will fund it if they think it's a good idea and there's opportunity to build a company out of it. And they also invest all the way up to late stage as well. So they are probably the biggest spectrum here. So that was a crash course in venture capital. I'll pause here for a quick sec. Does anyone have any questions before I talk about how you guys can think about translating your work into startups? Anyone online on Zoom? No? Okay. So McMaster. I've been at McMaster for 8 years, and I love it here. And I have seen McMaster change a lot in the last 8 years. And you really don't need to go far to see success stories. You got Triumvira from Jonathan Bramson, you got Turnstone, Lychee, you got Organo Biotech, Boyang Yang, Cemendex, Eric Brown, AI Valley, David Armstrong, Spendex, Toby was just here, but also Layla. Like, there's a lot of success stories here. These are all active companies that have all raised a lot of money and are translating work that was done here at McMaster into commercial markets. And of course, we had John's acquisition a few weeks ago from AstraZeneca. So there's a lot of good examples here. Yeah. No, I wanted to. Pardon me? What do you mean? I think it's a great success story. Well, I mean, these are all very successful companies. Don't get me wrong. Oh yeah, these are all quite big companies now. So Triumvira, for example, they're in phase 2 clinical studies right now on their CAR T cell. Turnstone, don't really know where they are right now. AI Valley, they're doing clinical validation right now on their AI-assisted endoscopy technique. Cemendex, Eric is developing novel antibiotics to combat antimicrobial resistance, and they've raised, I think, just over $1 million, and they're still quite early. But no, these are all quite successful companies, and there's many more. These are just some of the big ones. So you really don't need to go very far to see success here at McMaster. And obviously, AstraZeneca's bought acquisition of Fusion Pharmaceuticals a few weeks ago for 2 billion USD, I might add. So that's about 3.4 billion Canadian. It is a really nice success story for Hamilton, McMaster, and for John specifically. So what does the startup development process look like? Okay, so we're all going to be kind of operating right here. This is equivalent to that Valley of Death slide that I showed earlier. Academic research is fantastic, but a lot of it's exploratory. You really need to kind of figure out what your vision is and what your overall mission is for that company, and who are you going to want to work with. Your best friend or your supervisor might not be the best co-founder. I'll tell you that right now. You might work together very well in academia and doing good science, but when it comes to actually building a company, might not be the best parent. And those are blunt conversations that you need to have. Sure, there's an opportunity for people to be involved, but entering into a business partnership is a very different conversation compared to what a supervisor and trainee relationship actually is. And so figuring out who that founding team is probably the first key step to any successful business. You don't want to have a large founding team. Usually I say you never want to be a solo founder, number one. You want to have complementary founders that support areas where you might not have as much expertise in. Usually we like to see anywhere between 2 to 4 co-founders. 4 is sometimes a little much, but it really depends on the company. 2 to 3 is usually that sweet spot. Usually where you have a technical lead, you have a business lead, and you have someone that floats, someone who can think about the issues from a variety of angles. That's usually the structure that most early stage investors like to see. And this is applicable to any industry for that matter. Once you kind of form the team, then you got to start validating it. And what's really nice about academia is you've been doing validation work for 5 to 10 years. And so you know how the science works, you know your product. Now you actually need to apply it to a real world setting. So you need to start figuring out, okay, who do you want to align yourself with? Is it a hospital? Is it a grocery store if you're doing food testing? Is it a supply chain manager for food processing? I don't know. This is where you gotta start validating your actual academic research and technology in a real world setting. And then the hockey stick effect happens. You're very slow here, and then you lead to exponential growth. But that exponential growth is predicated on making sure that you form the right team and that you've done the proper validation. So do not discount these first 2 steps. So value proposition. A biomaterial is a substance that has been engineered to interact with biological systems. Where do you think I got that definition from? I did, yeah, Wikipedia. So I like that definition. Wikipedia might not be the best reputable source, but I like this definition because it's very broad. And biomaterials are, quite frankly, you might not appreciate it right now, but they are the future. They really are. And I say that also for the recording, so people who are watching this after the fact, I can have it on record that I am a very firm believer that biomaterials are undervalued right now from an investment standpoint and will be the future with respect to healthcare, with respect to industries, food processing, waste management, water filtration, et cetera. There's not enough investment and not enough translation of academic research in biomaterials into the actual market. And they kind of capture a lot of things. I mean, like prosthetics, dentistry, cosmetics, all of these industries are underpinned by biomaterials. And for the most part, a lot of these industries are focusing more so on the digital technology angle. How can you optimize it? But at the core of each of these products are biomaterials. How can you optimize it? How can you actually optimize it to interact with your patient, with your consumer? Those are key questions that need to be answered. And that's really where your value proposition comes from. I'm not here to tell you how to do your research. You know your research. You know what you've been doing for, if you're a master's student for 2 years, if you're a PhD student for 5 to 6 years, if you're a prof, your entire life. You know what you're doing. You just need to make sure you're able to communicate to the audience and to your investors and to consumers, why should I buy your product versus another person's product? How does your material optimize the interface of a prosthetic joint? How does your material prevent cavities from forming? How does your material able to prevent, I guess, degradation of cosmetics? I actually don't know the cosmetics industry all that well, so that's probably a bad example for me to put. But it's central. It's central to that area. And one area where I think biomaterials are really going to play a key role in is drug delivery and delivery of molecules. And that is central to all of these sectors. So always, always, always take the time to think about, you've developed this technology, in your research, you know the science behind it, how's it actually going to be applied, and can it be applied in different ways, and what's it going to take for you to actually validate those different use applications. That is at the core of what a value proposition is. And this is not an easy thing to define. It takes a lot of time, and a lot of late stage companies still don't have it right. But the earlier you can actually figure out what your value proposition is, the better and more successful you will be in actually raising money. So I realize we're at 3:20, so I'll kind of speed along to make sure we get time for Q&A. Market sizing is a big thing. Typically speaking, when you think about market sizing, we address it in kind of 3 stages. You have your total addressable market, so TAM. You have your serviceable available market, SAM, and you have your serviceable obtainable market, SOM. This one is the most important. Okay, what are you actually realistically going to achieve in the near future? And then your TAM is what's a total opportunity within the industry that you're trying to disrupt. And so there's kind of 2 main ways to do this. There's a top-down market sizing approach. So that's where you go from what is the overall opportunity. So that you'll find this from market research intelligence report. So say, what's it? Global Intelligence, actually that's actually a real company. They value the biomaterials market at $4 billion. So that's your total global market opportunity. Try to narrow that down to, okay, what is the opportunity in Canada specifically? What's your market? And that's going to be predicated on a lot of assumptions. So what patients, for example, if you're thinking about a disease, what patients are you trying to target? Or if you're looking at a, let's say, if you look at the biomaterials here, if you're talking about natural gas or oil production, what is the oil production in Canada? And more specifically, what's the oil production in Alberta? Those are assumptions that you need to very clearly make when trying to calculate your market opportunity. And then conversely, there's a bottom-up approach. Okay, so this is where you kind of go from your obtainable market all the way up to what is your total addressable market. And this approach is favored by most investors, especially when you've figured out how much you actually want to sell your product for, or how much you're actually going to get from a licensing deal. What's the opportunity? And so essentially, if you're going to sell, let's say, a material to a business for $10 per unit, okay, so that is a metric that you can use to calculate what is your total market opportunity from a revenue standpoint. Okay, so say $10, a company orders 10 units, so it's $100 per order. There's 100 companies out there that'll take it, so that's $10,000 per that area. And so you're slowly building up and up and up to what your total market opportunity is going to be. And these types of calculations can get quite sophisticated. The key thing you need to have is clearly defined assumptions. And so what does this actually look like in practice? This is actually a real example that I did on due diligence on a company. I've taken out the actual specifics for confidentiality reasons, but this was an example of a business-to-business SaaS company, so software as a service. So they were selling an enterprise software platform to optimize workflow. And so I wanted to figure out what is the actual opportunity for them in Canada alone. So I found that there were 2,717 firms that they were targeting in Canada to potentially license the actual software. I assumed an approval rate, so an acquisition, so who would actually use this license, of 10%. So that means the total number of firms that would use it would be 272. The annual licensing fee was $10,000. And so the size of Canadian firms alone was $2 million, $2.7 million per year in revenue. That was the opportunity. And then they also had additional lines where every time they got a response to a survey on their platform, they took a cut from that as well. And that would come down to a opportunity in Canada alone for 70.6 million. So the size of the response fees plus the size of license fees combined. And so this told me that the real value from this company isn't in the actual licensing fee, it's in the response fees. That's where the actual value is for this company, because that's what's going to generate the revenue. And so if you're able to kind of decipher in your startup, what are the various revenue chains that you can have, if you can diversify that for an investor, that's fantastic to see, because that allows you to pivot to focus on the chains that are working really well for you as a company. And this is really applicable for biomaterials companies because you are designing materials for a variety of applications. And you're also manufacturing them in a variety of different ways. And so if you realize that there's one method that is able to get you much more revenue than another method, then you should probably double down on that first method, because that's really where the core value is, and that's where the larger opportunity is. And then I did the exact same thing for the United States, combined them two, and got to a total opportunity of about $1,770,000,000 or so. That was the calculation I presented to the investment committee for this particular deal that I did 2 years ago. So that's a kind of real world example. So let's say that you founded a company, you've started to kind of spin it out of academia. Where to next? What are kind of the resources that you can use at your disposal to actually build that company? Well, there's a idea. Well, there are these various kind of firms out there called incubators and accelerator programs that are there to support early stage companies. And we have a number of them on campus, which I'll speak about in a second. But in general, an incubator program, they are ones that are there to provide just holistic general support to a company. So you can kind of be there for as long as you want. You typically have to spend $100 a month, for example, to have access to that firm. There are technical facilities at your disposal to support R&D, for example. There is rolling admission, so people can come in and leave as they want. And there's actual physical space. So Innovation Factory down on Longwood, fantastic example of an incubator program. Accelerator program are a little bit different. They are there, so incubators are there to help you, kind of like in that hockey stick analogy I gave you earlier. The incubators are there to kind of help slowly build you up a little bit. Accelerators are there to kind of accelerate that exponential growth. Okay, so they focus on trying to figure out how to best scale your company. There is a fixed duration for when you can actually be in that program. So usually these are 4, 8, or 12-month long durations. It's cohort based, so they will recruit you to actually come into the program, and they will focus on that specific cohort to help you grow the company. And oftentimes they're seed funded. So probably the most well-known accelerator in the world is Y Combinator. They are based out of California. They pretty much invented the idea of an accelerator program and have an extremely good track record. And so across incubators and accelerators, you have pretty similar services in terms of training, mentoring, business support. And in general, they're quite selective. If you're able to get into a highly accredited program through either incubator or accelerator, such as Y Combinator, it is a huge check mark of approval. So we spoke earlier about how $50K might not be a great investment, but you also get that stamp approval from an early stage VC firm. An accelerator program like Y Combinator, that will get you a meeting with all the major investors if you get that. So it's really important to think about strategically aligning with various programs. So we're kind of coming up on the hour, but I know we started late. What do you have access here at McMaster? Well, you have McMaster University Industry Liaison Office, for example. So they help deal with the tech transfer here at not UFT, at McMaster. You have the clinic at Mac over in health sciences. They do a lot of work in supporting early stage companies, especially when it comes to healthcare. And they have a bunch of biomaterial companies over there as well. You have McMaster Seed Fund. So that's relatively new a few years ago, where the university endowment actually gave a bunch of money to Lee Wilson, who is from Milo, and now she's managing a fund to invest into McMaster founded companies. So it's a great initiative. I fully support it. The Forge, so down Innovation Factory, they are an example of an accelerator program. So they are cohort based, where they will recruit you to come in and support your growth. And McMaster Innovation Park is, broadly speaking, an incubator facility. They have various programs there, including the Forge, that will help kind of percolate a company for the time being to get you to a point where you can go to McMaster Seed Fund, or we can get into the Forge, or go out to external investors to raise money. So there are resources available on campus to support you. So I really encourage you to think about that if you are looking to build a company. And that's me. So that's my LinkedIn. If you want to connect, I know I kind of rushed through a few things, but again, I wanted to make sure we ended on time, but also had time for Q&A at the end. Happy to connect. Happy to touch base asynchronously too, to speak about my journey through academia, my PhD, if you want to learn about that, and then kind of what I want to do next. Short answer is I don't know, and that's okay. I don't think any of us really know what we want to do in the end, and that's okay. But again, happy to talk further, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Questions from the audience? Please.
Yep.
Very nice site, Kyle. Thank you. Do you have any advice on how you would find investors, like in your particular field? Is there websites or networks you can access?
Yeah, so networking. So when you're trying to build a company, and this kind of goes back to the co-founders that I spoke about earlier, and we have three. So you have the technical lead, you have a business lead, and you have someone who floats. Usually the business lead and person that floats, they're the ones that need to constantly sell the idea. So they're the ones going to coffee chats, having coffee chats with people. They're going to conferences. So next week, for example, is kind of like the Super Bowl for healthcare investment in Canada. So Bloom Burton, which is an investment bank, as I said earlier, they're holding their investment conference next week. You have Discovery X, which is operated by the Ontario Centre of Innovations. You have Mintz, which is a major law firm in Canada and the United States, who will also hosting a healthcare investment network conference on the Monday. So it's those types of events that you need to go to meet with these investors and to sell your idea and to go out. LinkedIn is also a fantastic resource. Let me tell you, people will respond. I mean, I will respond. If you reach out to me with an idea, I will respond to you. Might be delayed, but you will get a response, especially if it's a cool idea. One thing I will say, when you are looking to engage with investors, whether that be an institutional investor like a formal venture capital firm or angel investors, more often than not, you're not going to hear back. Because they get hundreds of emails a day, and oftentimes they're just trying to clear their inboxes. And if you don't catch their attention right away, then there's a problem. So that's why you often need to go to these events, to these conferences, to these kind of happy hours, for example. Those matter a lot when trying to develop these relationships.
Maybe I can kind of riff off that.
Yeah.
What are some faux pas, some don't do's, when trying to reach out, connect either by LinkedIn or by email or even these conferences or even the socials? What are some sort of things where, like, maybe you and your investor buddies get in a room like, yeah, that guy did that, you don't. So, because otherwise you might do it. Well, we're never gonna know.
So I have my phone number on my email thing. Don't call me at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Oh.
Like I am up at that time sometimes. I don't like to be, but I am. I get like 4 hours of sleep on average now. But like, do I want to deal with a phone call from the founder at that time? No, I do not. So yeah, don't call at 1 o'clock in the morning. Other things that, like, first impressions matter a lot. And so don't willy-nilly reach out and say like, hey, like I have this idea, I have that idea, I might want to do this. If you're unfocused, you're just wasting our time. I'll be very blunt about that. And that's going to really turn me off from speaking to you ever in the future. If you are at a point where it's like, hey, I have this idea and I don't really know where to go, be upfront about that. And be like saying like, hey, like I have this preliminary pitch deck or a presentation of my research. I would love to talk to you about where you see this could go in the future from a company standpoint, and what do I need to achieve from milestones for you to potentially consider it being an investment opportunity. So always come prepared. Just like you're preparing for a committee meeting for your supervisor committee, you're not going to prepare that slide deck the night before and come half prepared. You're going to be having that prepared weeks in advance, for example, or maybe days in advance. You don't do the night before. It's like always be prepared, and also know who you're talking to. Like it's okay to LinkedIn stalk. I stalk people on LinkedIn all the time. It's really okay. You might feel weird about it at first, but we really don't care, and we're actually interested to see who. Yeah, no, it honestly. Oh, like you get pinged every once a week or so, saying like you got X number of views this week, and you can see who viewed it. That's interesting because it's interesting from an investor standpoint to see, okay, who am I actually reaching with my own brand? and who actually wants to talk to me. That's quite valuable to know. So don't feel like you need to hesitate when looking them up on LinkedIn.
Any other questions?
I can stay for a bit too if you want. If you want to kind of chat more one-on-one.
I could just keep on.
I know.
You guys already heard enough of me. So I just want to thank Kyle for a wonderful conversation. Starting off with theme on entrepreneurship, innovation, commercialization, and biomaterials, biofabrication, regenerative medicine. And really appreciate your time and your insights and sort of just giving us some education that we don't really get in standard curriculum here at McMaster. Thanks.
Happy to. Thank you.